But anyway, one day we were in the wagon line, quite a few hours, and somebody came along and said, oh, the war's finished. Oh, well, just go down about half a mile down the road and look in a field there, you'll see. Won't tell us why. Anyhow, we went down, and quite a crowd there. And there are tanks, things we'd never seen or heard of.
The early hours of the 11th of April 1917 were extremely cold. Snow was falling and there was a deeper coverage than the day before. The tanks had bivouacked close to the battlefield and it was hoped that they would make the jump-off point by 3 a.m. The tanks were to start their attack at 4:30 a.m. The infantry would commence their attack at 4:45 a.m. The artillery would only shell the flanks and run corps. There would be no pre-battle artillery shelling to damage the German defences or creeping artillery barrage to support the infantry. Once again, enormous objectives were set for the infantry. This is the original 14th Battalion map, which shows that there was 3 objectives. The third objective extended as far as Encourt, some 3 kilometres away, which is a long way to go when you're being shot at. Likewise, the tank commander's objectives were written as if the tanks were totally invincible to German machine guns and artillery. These thoughts were to be proved wrong. One of the main problems for the troops was the battlefield. It was a re-entrant, where advancing troops could be fired upon from both flanks and from the German forward positions ahead. Out in no man's land with the men, Jacka heard the tanks approaching. The tanks started to arrive on the battlefield just before 3 a.m. Jacka began to assign the position of the tanks in front of the 2 forward battalions, the 14th Battalion and the 16th Battalion. The 14th Battalion men were to advance with Central Road on their left. To their right was the 16th Battalion. Behind them, in support, were the 13th and the 15th Battalions. Jacka was told by one of the tank officers that it was not possible for the tanks to cross the 700 metres of no man's land in the 15 minutes allocated. The Mark I tanks were not fast and were lucky to make 2 miles per hour at full speed. A man walks at 4 miles per hour. It was obvious to Jacka that the man would reach the wire before the tanks. Jacka reported this to Peck at 3:05 a.m. Peck and the 16th Battalion commander Drake Brockman tried to have the tanks leave earlier, but this was rejected by higher command. Jacka went back to the battlefield to place the other tanks. One of these tanks did not follow Jacka's instructions and become ditched in the sunken road. The crew abandoned the tank. Seeing this, Jacka threatened to shoot the crew. Another tank had broken down before reaching the battlefield. This only left 3 tanks in front of the 14th and 16th Battalions. These tanks were commanded by Clarkson and Davies, the third either Puttick or Morris. On the battlefield it was completely dark. However, the Germans had heard the noise of the approaching tanks and started shelling at 4:23 a.m. The 3 tanks in front of the 14th and the 16th Battalions moved off at 4:30 a.m. It is doubtful if any of the other tanks made it to the starting line by 4:30. This caused the 12th Brigade battalions on the left to delay their advance. Jacka and his assistant, Lieutenant McKinlay, were talking when a shell fell close to them. McKinlay was mortally wounded, while Jacka's luck remained, as he was only blown off his feet without injury. At 4:40 a.m, German flares lit up the battlefield. As the infantry jump-off time of 4:45 approached, mates shook hands and wished each other good luck. Then, at 4:45, punctual to the second, the 14th and the 16th Battalion men moved off. The 4th Brigade was a magnificent body of men, led by the very best Australian officers. The Australian official historian Charles Bean wrote that the 14th Battalion Company commanders as a team can never be surpassed in the AIF. They were Captains Lofty Williamson, Fred Stanton, William Wadsworth, and Robert Orr. Western Australia's finest, the 16th Battalion, was being led into battle by Major Percy Black. Black was acknowledged by many as being the bravest man in the AIF. Black, who had a Kitchener look about him, was a 38-year-old gold prospector from Yilgarn in Western Australia. Behind him, leading the 13th Battalion, was Captain Harry Murray. He was a mate of Percy Black's from the earliest days of the AIF. Murray had already earned a VC for courage at Stormy Trench a few months prior. The Davies tank was veering to the right and would no longer be seen on this part of the battlefield. Halfway across, at about 5 a.m, the first waves of the Australian infantry came over a gentle rising crest into view of the Hindenburg Line. The Germans intensified the heavy machine gun and rifle fire into the Australian lines. At this point, the infantry caught up to the remaining two tanks, which were found to be stationary, firing towards the Germans 300 metres away. The tanks then followed the troops. The Morris or Puddick tank soon after returned to the railway embankment. Jacka's warning was coming true, that the infantry would be facing heavily defended Germans without broken wire or artillery barrage. Captain Orr of the 14th was mortally wounded and took shelter in a shell hole. On the right, Major Percy Black took over the charge, shouting, "Come on boys, bugger the tanks!" This battle was the triumph of his life. It was now almost daylight, and a great part of the 16th men were dead or wounded in front of the wire. Men were lashing at the barbed wire with bayonet. Few had wire cutters. Some tried to leapfrog from strand to strand, only to become hopelessly entangled. Black and others found a gap in the wire and advanced into the Hindenburg Trench. 300 metres behind the 16th Battalion, Captain Murray seen the carnage ahead. Murray rallied his men to assist the 16th. By the time the 13th reached the wire, the Clarkson tank was part the way through, so Murray tried to make a way through on the left of the tank. After killing a German machine gun crew and receiving a bullet graze across his neck, he was into the German trenches. The Australians were well known for being fierce trench fighters, and they soon overcome the Germans. On Captain Murray's left, the 14th Battalion had a severe time trying to find a gap in the wire, which in their section was 25 metres deep. As the 12th Brigade and the tanks that were supposed to come up Central Road had not yet advanced, the German machine guns fired into their left. Around 5:15 a.m, the 4th Brigade, against all odds, had secured the Hindenburg Line's first trench. The 14th Battalion was now joined by the 15th, and the men rushed towards the second objective, which was the Germans' support trench. It was during this attack the courageous Captain Stanton was killed, leading a rush for the second wire. Minutes later, Captain Lofty Williamson, a 23-year-old schoolteacher from Victoria, was mortally wounded when he too climbed out and went forward, practically alone, the third to fall of the famous team of commanders of the 14th Battalion. Further along, Major Percy Black was working his way through the same wire. He had just turned to his runner to give a progress message when his arms flung up and he fell to the ground, the great man being shot through the head. Harry Murray said his death was a calamity to all Australians in the trenches that day. The 12th Brigade, on the far left, advanced at 5:16 a.m, and by 5:56 they also held the first two objectives. As the intelligence officer, Jacka was not commanding frontline troops. He had followed the last wave of the 14th Battalion over into battle. Jacka sent back a message at 5:16 to say that the first objective had been taken. At 6:03, he sent another to say the second objective had been won. With daylight, the German artillery barrage and machine gun fire had greatly intensified in no man's land, stopping any ammunition reinforcement parties advancing. At 7:15, Murray sent back the famous message of the Bullecourt battle, stating, "With artillery we can keep the position till the cows come home." At 18 minutes past 7, Jacka returned to the 14th Battalion headquarters and reported to Peck directly of the failure of the tanks and the resulting heavy loss of infantry on the wire. It was obvious to all concerned in the front-line battalions that the need for artillery support was critical. However, in what was to be the major blunder of the battle, no Australian artillery was forthcoming. During the morning, no less than 18 SOS rocket requests and numerous messages were made for artillery support. An Australian Artillery Group Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rabbit, refused the repeated requests. He believed his artillery observers had seen troops and tanks far advanced in Runcorn. Finally, an appeal was made to Birdwood to overrule Rabbit. Birdwood refused to overrule,